Good segue to get us into Russ Schindler. But now he has Sample Serve. And you've had Sample Serve, gosh, how many years now?
Well, actually, we started in 2001, but
Whoa,
we weren't
yeah,
really a tech company back then.
yeah.
That's really kind of been a more recent innovation.
And mind you, you can explain it much better than I. So why don't you tell folks what you bring to the party?
Sure. So we actually started as a company that collected environmental samples. Primarily, I'm a geologist, so I started out doing groundwater investigations and cleanup. And when you're doing an investigation cleanup, you have to collect samples all the time. Um, so I started a company that specialized in collecting samples, Sample Serve. And as time went on, we started creating software for facilitating the collection of the samples, putting labels on them, having the label be able to be read by the laboratory because you got to collect it at the point of origin or where the contaminant is, and send it to the lab, and then the lab does their test, and then that data from the lab and the data from the sample collection have to be married together, and then somebody's got to write some kind of report on it. Um, so that's what our software does. Basically, we help people collect samples, communicate with the lab, get the data back from the lab, and then we can generate all the reports that somebody needs to comply with whatever environmental or regulatory requirement. So in the environmental world, it's images like this back here that show you where the contamination is, where it isn't. In the cannabis world, it's probably just more of a paper. We're not big into the reporting side yet, but just basically paper documentation showing you what the THC level is, the E. coli levels, all that stuff. So we've got a unique process for collecting those samples and labeling them. We use a mobile device, so we're totally paperless. So you collect all the information on a tablet like this, and then we print the labels out on a Bluetooth thermal label printer, and the labels end up looking like this. It has a barcode on the side, a QR code. That's kind of a three-piece label. You can actually use the second QR code and actually leave it at the point of sample collection. So if you're doing cannabis sampling and you've collected out of a container or a bag of cannabis, you can leave that second QR code on the bag and then come back later once the lab results are done, just scan that QR code and you know what the results are of that particular bag of cannabis. So it really kind of facilitates the data flow quickly. There's no having to, have a bunch of papers you got to shuffle through and find results, or, submit paperwork to the laboratory and then they have to type it all in. It's all digital from the point of origin all the way back to, even the consumer could theoretically scan their product and pull up and get the results of their particular.
Sort of the chain of custody, as it were, right?
Yeah, so we actually have two patents on digital chain of custody, and that's that process of identifying, who collected the sample, where it was collected, and how it got to the laboratory. So it's, chain of custody is really like who and where and when, and then not just the point that the sample was collected, but who had custody of it from that point all the way to the laboratory. Then that allows you to track down if there's been any product tampering or maybe some kind of unintended contamination of the product. You'll be able to it helps you trace that. And then and not only that, in the cannabis world, it could track, whether they're paying their taxes or not. So.
And I'd imagine that would work in the hemp space as well, right? I know same farmers have much bigger fields and whatnot, but they have all the same issues that any other farmer or grower would have, right? Same way in hemp.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, we had a call recently with somebody who's doing fish tissue sampling. So they catch fish. You need to identify the fish. They actually take a tissue sample out of the side of the fish and then let it go. But they need to track that fish tissue all the way to the lab. And then we also had a conversation with an arson investigator, right? So arson investigators, when you're in a situation where somebody could potentially go to jail, chain of custody is real important to just document where you collected the evidence, keep the photographs and the GPS kind of tied to that sample. So whenever you take a sample, you're going to also take some photographs, and all that data gets tied together as one kind of record. and then that goes to the lab and then back to the report. Without it's a seamless process so that you can generate things faster and you're more certain of the accuracy.
And so, what you'd like to do is work with the testing labs for both hemp and cannabis, right?
Yeah, and so we have a lot of labs that have talked about, we've had conversation with labs. We've even had some labs try it out where they're collecting samples and then sending them to the lab. We don't have any big users yet, but in the cannabis world, in the environmental world, we've got tons of users all over the country, and we're doing very well in that area. We're just now kind of, the COVID thing has kind of put us behind schedule when it comes to rolling out a complete rollout of our cannabis product. But we've got everything in place. We just really need some people to really get out there and test it for us.
Yeah, I know earlier this year, like everyone else, you pivoted into something to do with COVID. And in your case, it was drive up testing that you were working with some folks on making sure that the sample, when it was drawn by the health person, would then you could track it all the way through the system. I'll let you explain it better than I just did.
Well, it's basically the same thing. We don't really care what you put in the bottle, right? So you collect a sample of anything, put it in here. We want to track it all the way to the lab and back. So when the data comes back, they reference these numbers with the data back, and that works for COVID. It works for cannabis. It works for groundwater. It could work for arson samples. It doesn't really matter, and that's really the key to our process is um, the digital chain of custody, collecting samples or evidence or whatever you want to call it. And then there's always data associated with it. It's not just the thing you put in the jar. There's going to be a bunch of questions that you ask while you're collecting that sample. Like you would with COVID, you want to know, have you been out of the country in the last 2 weeks? The questions like that. And so you keep all that kind of sample data tied together all the way through the lab and then back to the report. And that's really the single biggest benefit of our software packages. Is we're able to do that, and we don't really care what you're sampling. The questions will be different, so we'll need to know what you're sampling, so you can create your own kind of custom questionnaire. But that's the beauty of our product is that it keeps it all together.
Rick, do you have any questions?
Well, typically sampling of cannabis is done by the testing laboratories in a cultivation center. They're required to travel out to the cultivation center, sample from multiple particular spots within the cannabis garden or within the cannabis batch itself. Imagine a batch being a 10-pound bag of cannabis, and they have to find 5 different places inside there to sample from. And then that particular testing laboratory representative drives that directly back to his testing lab and conducts the tests there. So chain of custody in that instance seems pretty tight. Is there a market in the cannabis industry that you're targeting that goes beyond just regulatory cannabis testing?
Well, you're right. It is typically the same company, but it's usually the person collecting the samples, not the person doing the testing. And they may have 7 or 8 people out there, doing the sample collection, and then they drop them off at the lab and then head back out to collect another batch. And so there is just the issue when you're using paper and pen, you have penmanship problems. That's probably the biggest issue is data entry errors. And so when you're collecting data digitally, you're usually typing it in. So, you can see, our sample labels are all printed. And so it just allows for less data entry errors and a lot faster sample collection. And the type of sampling that you're referring to is called a composite sample. And so you can very quickly just kind of go, this is a composite sample. And you took 7 locations within the bag. You can even identify them, top, middle, bottom, and then composite them together. And so just that data flow, data collection, it makes it more uniform and consistent. And then there is no more transcription errors and no more data entry problems.
Excellent. So it sounds like that will meld very well with the regulated cannabis industry. In the hemp industry here in Michigan, testing is not required until the end of the harvest itself, but oftentimes hemp farmers test multiple times during the harvest to check THC levels to make sure that they're not exceeding their thresholds, that their crop doesn't go, quote, hot. And it sounds like your system would be ideal for that because in that instance, a lot of times hemp farmers don't have a lot of structure, they don't have a lot of experience, and if it's easy to do data entry into your system, they could more accurately track where their samples are coming from which part of the farm, and then have a better idea of what environmental factors may be affecting their crop.
That's right. There may be some areas of that hemp grow that are above limits, and then the rest of them are not. So they can know that ahead of time and then work out methods to, make sure that the overall product leaving the farm is below the threshold limit.
And hemp farming is very organic like, so they need to know heavy metals, things like that, what's in their fields. So I think it would work for that as well, right?
I
Yeah,
think so too.
every time you collect a sample using our device, it records a GPS coordinate. And the GPSs on these are pretty good. They're going to be within about 10 feet of where you're at. So on a big field, 10 feet's probably close enough. There's even add-on devices that you can plug into your, like different ports in here that'll increase that accuracy to a couple of inches. So you just take this in there, collect the samples. It's labeled automatically using the label printer, and now you can literally map. And that's one of the things that we do because we know the GPS. We can map where every sample came from. So,
Nice.
yeah. And
That's
there's other ways you could do that manually, but we'll have it all done literally within seconds.
So
a
then,
labor-saving
oh, go
device,
ahead,
sure.
Rick.
Just a labor-saving device. A lot of the things that we're talking about doing could be reproduced through, as you mentioned, paper and pen type methodology. But to bring your harvest and your monitoring system up into the technological age, that's really the only way to be profitable in the modern society. It sounds like you're helping people who maybe are still Matt Patricia with that pencil behind his ear every single time,
Right.
scribing these notes down, bringing them up into a 2020 world.
Yeah, and we're going to, in the environmental industry, which I don't think the cannabis industry is going to be a whole lot different, we're saving people in the field about 20% of their time. And when it comes to the reporting side, we're saving people about 80% of their time. So it's a huge savings.
Time is money.
Yep.
So how do you lease the equipment? Do you sell the equipment? How do you do it?
So we have a lease program where you can get the tablet and printer for $99 a month. But if you want to buy them, it's about $1,100 of equipment. And if people want to buy them, that's fine. We don't make any money off of equipment. It's mostly a price per sample fee, and depending on volume for cannabis, you're going to be in the $1 to $2 per sample range. So pretty. If you're collecting 100 samples, it's $100 plus or minus. That's if you're collecting a high volume. So just call us and we'll give you a quote for actual pricing.
Okay. Well, so which begs the question, why don't you go ahead and give that contact information?
Okay, it's sampleserve.com. You can see the name right there, sampleserve.com. And my name is Russell Schindler, and it's just Russell at sampleserve.com.